The number 4 in Judaism is a recurrent number. There are so many different aspects of Jewish life that involve the number 4. Holiday of Passover, for example, which is the theme of this week's Torah portion, the portion called Vaeira, is a holiday where the number 4 is persistent. You have it all over the place. But we have the number 4 in so many different areas of Judaism. God's name, for example, has 4 letters to it. There are 4 spiritual worlds. And the holiday of Sukkot, we take 4 different species. But let's see what the Torah says about the 4 expressions of redemption in this week's parsha. God tells Moses to tell the Jewish people that they're going to be liberated, but he doesn't just use one expression, he uses 4 expressions. Therefore, say to the children of Israel, I am God, and I will take you out from under the burdens of Egypt. Expression number 1, I'll take you out from under the burdens of Egypt. Statement number 2, and I will save you from their labor. Number 3, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. And expression number 4, I will take you as a people for myself. So these 4 expressions are actually the basis for the requirement that we drink 4 cups of wine. Each cup of wine is to express gratitude to God for liberating us from one aspect of the bondage in Egypt. Kli Yakar, one of the classic commentators on the Torah, says that there are actually 4 different stages of freedom that took place at the time of the Exodus, because slavery was not just slavery. There were really 4 parts to it. Number 1, they were tortured. You could be a slave and not be tortured. Number 2, they were slaves. They had no freedom. Number 3, they couldn't leave the country. And number 4, they had no identity. They were not a people. So the first thing that happened is that they were no longer slaves. Actually, our sages tell us that Rosh Hashanah, 6 months before the Exodus, they were no longer required to do torturous slave labor. But that's not enough. They were still slaves. They didn't have their own identity as free people. So you can be freed from torture, but still be a slave. They were freed from slavery, but they couldn't leave the country. In modern times, we had the Soviet Union. Jews weren't slaves there necessarily. People weren't slaves there, but they couldn't leave the country. The Jews were liberated from Egypt. So that's number 3. But what about number 4? Number 4 is where they acquired an identity. When they got the Torah at Mount Sinai, that's what made them truly free. Now, it's interesting that there's a parallel holiday to Passover. In many respects, there are similarities, and that's the holiday of Sukkot or Sukkot. And there, too, we have 4 species that we take. We take the palm branch from a date palm, the lulav. We take an etrog, an esrog. It's a lemon-like fruit. We take hadassim, myrtles, and we take aravos, willows. And these 4 species are taken together. We recite a blessing over them. It could be suggested that these 4 species correspond to the 4 expressions of redemption. In other words, there is a parallel between the 2 holidays, but with a caveat. Passover represents the beginning of the process of redemption, when people were still raw, people still had a connection and a tie to the Egyptian slavery experience. And Sukkot is where the Jewish people are already in the desert, they're traveling away from Egypt, they received the Torah at Mount Sinai, and they are able to devote themselves to spiritual pursuits. So let's take the 4 species and see how they relate to Passover. One of the species is the willow. The willow, the Midrash says, resembles the mouth. The mouth represents speech. So Sukkot is about speech, yes, but so is Passover. The Arizal, the great Kabbalist, tells us that the word in Hebrew for Passover, Pesach, is actually a composite of 2 words. Pesach, the mouth speaks. When the Jews were slaves in Egypt, they couldn't speak. They couldn't express themselves. They were crushed, and their speech was suppressed. When they were liberated, they were able to express themselves. They were able to speak. So we have the element of speech in Passover and the element of speech in Sukkot. The only difference is that in Passover, speech was something that was suppressed beforehand, and they were just barely able to express themselves. Later on, when the Jews were in the desert, their speech was one that was flowed freely. In fact, they were even beyond speech. We're taught in Kabbalah that the generation of the desert, the people were in the world of thought. They were more spiritual. It's not that they couldn't express themselves. They didn't want to express themselves verbally. They were able to because they were above and beyond expression through speech. Whereas the Jews who came out of Egypt couldn't speak. Their speech was in prison until the Exodus. So we have the parallel here with a difference. The esrog, this Midrash tells us, represents the heart, emotions. When the Jews were slaves in Egypt, their emotions were occluded. They couldn't express their emotions. We know Jews who went through the Holocaust couldn't cry for years because their emotions were so occluded, were so suppressed. The Jews in the desert, they had their emotions sometimes in the wrong direction, but their emotions were alive and vibrant. The people would use it for either complaining or for good things, but they had live emotions. At Passover, the emotions was just barely beginning to allow themselves to be expressed. And then we have the hadassim, the myrtles. The myrtles resemble the eye. The Jews in Egypt, they couldn't open their eyes to see anything positive. All they could see was negative. The liberation of the eye meant that they were able to finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. Sukkot is where the Jewish people are in the desert. Their eyes were open. They were able to see the positive in a very open way, in a very clear way. And then finally, we have the lulav. The lulav, the Midrash tells us, represents stubbornness, stiff-neckedness. The Jewish people in Egypt were stubborn, that they refused to recognize that there's any possibility of them being liberated until they were liberated. But then in the desert, the Jewish people's stiff-neckedness didn't serve them very well. They were accused of being stiff-necked because they rebelled constantly. So we have a parallel between the two holidays that revolve around the four different species and the four expressions of redemption. The ultimate redemption that will take place also will involve these four different elements. We will be able to speak. Our power of speech will be strong and vibrant. Our emotions will be completely open. We will not have to be able to suppress. We won't want to suppress our emotions. We will see the good in everything. We will see the divine in everything. And finally, our stubbornness that we express now, that we're not giving up our belief in and hope for the imminent coming of Mashiach, will serve us in good stead.